So good morning, everyone. We've been really encouraged by all the great work that's been profiled here today. I'm Jaime Gonzalez with the Nature Conservancy in Texas. We appreciate you having us here today. We're here today to talk about rest stops, which is resilience, ecology, shade, and transit, which is a concept to help Houston thrive by advancing equity and climate justice for people and wildlife, the whole living community, through better bus stops. It's a joint project of Link Houston, which advocates for equitable transportation, leads our team, and will guide community planning. TNC Texas, which tackles tough issues using nature-based solutions, and HARC, which brings environmental data and environmental science to inform action. So we love our city, and its strength is in its diversity. Houston is the most ethnically diverse major metro area in the country. It's also a biodiversity hotspot with 10,000 recorded species. But the human and wild communities are both at increased risk for climate crisis and chronic systemic issues like transit. Bus stops are locations where many challenges intersect in day-to-day life, such as inequity in transportation access, climate-enhanced flooding, inadequate nature, and extreme heat. Even today, during the pandemic, 92,000 residents in Houston use the bus daily, and 85% are people of color. Houston is also the poster child for the climate crisis with historic flooding and extreme heat, particularly impacting BIPOC and low-income communities disproportionately. Lastly, nature and park inequity is creating a hotter, more floodable, and less biodiverse Houston, including in neighborhoods that are BIPOC and low income. So what if we solved for multiple problems using nature, and it would benefit both the human and wild communities? So what if we change that to this at some of our bus stops? One neighborhood where this could happen is Gulfton, a vibrant and diverse community where 94% of the population are people of color, and which is a primary destination for recent immigrants, including from Afghanistan. Gulfton is a wonderful neighborhood, but highly vulnerable to urban heat island effect, green space inequities, and biodiversity loss. It's also a community where many rely on transit to get to work, to the grocery store, to school, and other parts of our city. So we wanted you to hear from a Gulfton resident, Antonio Martinez.
Waiting for the bus out here in the heat of the Houston summer, it's a bit uncomfortable because if you don't have a shelter, you don't have a tree, or you don't have anything. You know, sometimes I try, depending on the angle of the sun, I try to catch the shade of a sign or a building or a tree. But it would be important to set up some kind of shade device using nature, or just using a typical shelter or trees to provide shade for us, people who ride the bus and really depend on this type of transportation to get around town. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jonathan Brooks with Link Houston. Just to make sure the PowerPoint's working here. All right. Sorry about that. Thank you, Antonio. I'm Jonathan Brooks with Link Houston. We've spent recent years advocating alongside Gulfton for a new bus route, which, although delayed by the pandemic, began operating last month. Antonio is standing at one of the new bus stops. The Rest Stops project will build on our team's past work in Gulfton and other communities. So let me highlight how and what Rest Stops will actually do in 3 phases. Phase 1 brings together community and science. We will use shovel-ready, cutting-edge data to identify priority communities based on exposure to high heat, flooding, limited tree canopy, and social equity. We will then build community-based participatory research teams, a critical component of our work in sustained community development. The community team will include residents, bus riders, grass stop leaders, and organizations. People we already know from ongoing work, but also new contacts. Phase 2 is to iterate community-driven workshops, bringing data to inform the work, to identify a palette of solutions based on the bus stop and nature context. Our community team will leverage their knowledge of where infrastructure and services are failing and nature is lacking, and be our full partners in exploring options for both hyperlocal and systemic change. We will reduce barriers to participate by providing compensation, bus passes, meals, and offering translation. We will invite local government and the Metro Transit Authority into each meeting and the process. We will also leverage our existing local native plant palettes, specifically for Houston. Phase 3 is to demonstrate on-the-ground change, real tactile examples at pilot bus stops. Demonstrations are especially compelling to Houston leaders. Rest stops themselves will physically seek to address intersected challenges, shade for urban heat, green stormwater mitigation, support for natural biodiversity, and climate-friendly travel. We will also craft a toolkit of quantitative and qualitative scalable, replicable methods so other communities and regions can catalyze change too. We will empower communities to shape the public narrative and to seek systems change, calling on officials to synchronize otherwise siloed efforts. To that end, the following is a message from Sandra Rodriguez, the president of the Gulfton Super Neighborhood.
Nature will benefit our riders in the Gulfton neighborhood because as we're standing here next to the 309 Gulfton Circulator bus stop, there's absolutely no shade. And there are many bus stops throughout the Gulfton neighborhood that are very similar to this. Creating greener rest stops will help us accomplish a complete community. So it aligns perfectly with what we, the community, the residents, businesses, partners are trying to do. And so this may seem a small project, but to our neighborhood, it's big, it's important.
We love supporting Sandra in Gulfton. Sandra is actually joining us today live for the Q&A. While our team will center community, we're deeply aware of the broader ecosystem. We will bring other key stakeholders and partners along. We're not starting from scratch. Rather, what we're really doing is activating recent local government commitments contained in many plans, which we were part of making happen, which we want to see off the shelves and on the street. Plans by the City of Houston, Harris County, Metro, and our regional council. Rest stops brings focused, intersected implementation. So we invite you to get on the bus with us so we can go from this to this. Rest stops for a thriving, equitable, just, resilient Houston, for people and wildlife, for and with the whole living community. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. We welcome your questions. I also want to invite our rest of our team real quick to get on. That Sandra Rodriguez from the Gulfton neighborhood. Also my colleagues at Link Houston, Ines Siegel, Ashley Johnson, Mara, and unfortunately one of our colleagues is in the hospital, but he's faring well. And then also Dr. Ryan Baer and Dr. Meredith Jennings at Hark.
Wonderful evaluators. Feel free. Benita, you want to
start? Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this. It was a very interesting proposal to read. Is like I was thinking how innovative it was, and I also heard some similar projects happening in Sacramento. I was curious about. It sounds like the specific outcomes from this proposal will be around 2 to 3 bus stop pilots. Is that right? And then the follow-on question is really what are your metrics? So what are you hoping to evaluate just specifically through this grant? I know there's a sort of overall well-being outcomes, and of course the experience is very important. Would love to hear a little bit more about the metrics as well.
Absolutely. So how about I answer the first question? I might turn a little bit to Jaime and maybe Ryan or Meredith for the second part about metrics too, with some of the science. In terms of, we wanted to make sure this project did not just create another plan or more thinking. And so we would scale our project based on how much was awarded, either 50 to 100,000. And we want to do 1, 2, or 3 pilots because we actually want to create capital investment and do some of the change to really demonstrate and make a compelling case for making this more systemic. That's especially invaluable at this time because there are all those other plans that all have been completed in the last 18, 24 months, even with the pandemic. And so there's going to be a lot of implementation. It's whether or not it's intersected. And so we want to bring resources to the communities. So that's why we're committing just a few locations in a couple of communities. Gulfton would be one of those priority communities. Jaime, Ryan, Meredith, anyone else want to talk about maybe how we can measure some of the outcomes from this?
Yeah, I'll just take it real quickly in terms of the biodiversity. There's lots of metrics I think we could look at for the human riders, right? But because this is a One Health concept where we're integrating human and wildlife health, we're already activating community science through iNaturalist to document the living community of Houston, including Gulfton. We're actually mapping it right now through a Greener Gulfton process. So we can actually engage writers and other people to help us collect data there to see where that biodiversity uplift is happening while we're making a lot better stops for our human residents that are a lot more comfortable.
Yeah, so, and let me just, one last thought there would be, Ms. Hussein, was that we would really want to measure the change for the people and wildlife, and then also for the nature itself, but specifically for wildlife too. Trying to make this a very intersected example, and based on what's possible, given the locations and the space and what the community wants, that might vary a little bit.
Right.
I wanted to ask you, how do you see the process of scaling up, of doing 2 or 3, but maybe in 3 years have 50 bus stops? How to move in that direction? And by the way, one of the things that I find is that it would be ideal to have those in the most visible places, so that when people see it, people say, "Oh, I wanna do one like that." So how do you see the scaling up?
Excellent question and a great suggestion. Making sure that because the pilots need to have that impact, that could be certainly a criteria, and that'll vary by the community. In terms of scaling up, let me just quickly highlight, even just this summer, our transit authority, Metro, announced they're starting a climate action planning process for the agency. The last 3 years, they've spent more than $100 million on improving universal access at bus stops. But we have 99,200 bus stops. The majority of those do not have any shelter of any type, and trees are often not in proximity. So in terms of scaling up, one thing we're doing is there are existing processes and investments happening that we want to inject more intersections into. The city's work on sidewalks and green stormwater mitigation as part of Resilient Houston and the climate action plan is often considered separately, and the communities are being asked to go to a bunch of different meetings and try to engage in all these processes, and we want to try to bring that together. Could I invite Sandra? Would you mind unmuting for a second and talking just briefly about kind of how this is coming together a bit in Gulfton and some of the success we've had?
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here and support our team here in Houston, Link Houston. So we've been working closely for the last few years, actually since 2016, 17, with our Complete Communities Action Plan. The mayor selected 5 pilot neighborhoods to focus on in different areas: health, parks and amenities, education, etc. And so we've been working closely around transportation. And this past summer, we were able to, after years of advocating, along with Link Houston and many of the community residents, we were able to implement the 309 Gulfton Circulator, which is with Metro, which focuses only in the Gulfton neighborhood. And as you saw in the videos, some of these bus stops have no shading. And our community is primarily pedestrian oriented and rely heavily on public transit. Our community is majority newcomers. We get newcomers almost all the time. And so for our community, it's important to integrate into our system, our understanding the transportation system. One of the biggest challenges that we do have is green space. Gulfton has 1 single family home community, 60 multifamily housing properties in a 3-mile radius. And so we're densely populated, almost 60,000 people. And that's not including all those that we're not counting during the census. And so we have one major park that needs a lot of work. And I think this project will tie into everything else that we're working on with Complete Community. We're also with Jaime working on creating a greener Gulfton. So it will tie in with that project. We are working on improving the parks. So it works perfectly.
Thank you, Sandra. So we think there's a lot of momentum to harness, and that's really the role of this project, is to create the intersections that Otherwise, we're not going to see this change really happen. And bus stops is a really effective way to reach the people that need deeply affordable, practical, dignified access to opportunity.
I've got
Jonathan, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, thanks. Just curious have you to talk a little bit about the way that you're working with the transit agency. Presumably, if this is going to scale up and really take off, you're going to need them to kind of jump on this and start to replicate it across the city, the other 9,000 bus stops. So just will you talk a little bit about kind of what you see the uptake is and the chance for this to grow and how you're working with the transit agency?
Excellent question. Happy to speak to that. And if someone else has a remark, jump into. So we work fairly proactively with the transit agency. We receive no financial support from them. None of our partners do, but we advocate with them and we bring community members to their processes also and empower people to really understand how decision-making happens. So we think there's been a lot of synergy. As Sandra mentioned, the Gulfton 309 bus route is an entirely new bus route that began operating on August 22nd, last month, after several years of advocacy. Now there's a case for making the bus stops better. So in terms of scaling up, it's more of kind of, we understand how they budget and they're budgeting around universal access, which is a very worthwhile initiative. They do quite a bit of investment on bikeways and other purely transportation items. So what we want to do is really help them think about the broader design and nature implements. And then one other key stakeholder that's part of this that we communicate with and our partners we work fairly well with are Houston has quite a few special districts, these special government districts, commercial zones, and they actually do a lot of the better bus stop improvements and they have more resources. But this project will specifically not be limited to only locations that happen to have that resource. We would proactively pick communities that both have those resources of a commercial district with infrastructure money, but also ones that do not. And we might focus our rest stops money in the community without, and then work very earnestly to bring the other stakeholders to put their resources into this kind of project. So that's hopefully illustrative.
Very much. Yeah, I just want to make sure we have one last question and we're pretty much out of time. So Jalon.
Yeah, I'll make it quick. Thanks so much. So my question, when I read in your application materials, you were very intentional in saying that you didn't engage the community at that point. And so I appreciate Ms. Rodriguez hearing from you. And I just want to know, whose idea was this? Was it the community's idea or was it Lake's?
Actually, neither in origin. Meredith, you want to unmute and describe a little bit of?
Yeah, sure. Yes. So Jaime and I were on a team of with the City of Houston and Harris County Public Health last summer, conducting community science heat mapping. So we actually went out into Houston and Harris County with volunteers measuring urban heat islands. And so when we got our results back, we saw that a lot of the communities that were warmer than others were places like Gulfton, where you had a lot of people riding the bus and these streets were hot with no shade. So we reached out to our partners at Link Houston and said, hey, you want to take a look at this with us? And we formed this team together.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Houston.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Houston.